A pilot's finger rests on a trigger. Below, an unarmed man stands exposed on a beach, weaponless, defenseless, looking up at the machine that could end his life in less than a second. The pilot has clearance. He has the altitude. He has 6.50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready. But he does not fire. In 3 seconds, that choice will define the next 4 decades of his life. Though he cannot know it yet, the war will end, but this moment will not. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The roots of this moment stretch back years before that September morning, back to the doctrines and assumptions that shaped how America and Japan prepared for war in the Pacific. The United States Army Air Forces in 1941 was an organization built around a theory that strategic bombing could win wars by destroying an enemy's industrial capacity and breaking civilian morale. This theory, developed by air power advocates like Billy Mitchell and refined at the Air Corps Tactical School, envisioned fleets of heavy bombers striking deep into enemy territory while fighters provided escort and air superiority. It was a doctrine designed for the war in Europe, where targets were factories and rail yards and oil refineries, where the enemy had an industrial base that could be systematically dismantled. The Pacific War shattered that doctrine almost immediately. Japan's empire sprawled across thousands of miles of ocean, thousands of islands and territories where industrial infrastructure barely existed. The targets were not factories but supply dumps, not rail yards but jungle trails, not cities but villages where a dozen soldiers might shelter in native huts. Strategic bombing had its place. The B-29 raids on Japan proper proved that, but the daily work of the Pacific Air War fell to tactical aircraft, the fighters and light bombers that flew low and close, that hunted individual targets, that killed not industries but people. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed for this work. Republic Aviation built it to escort bombers over Germany, to fight at high altitude where its turbocharged engine gave it advantages, to absorb battle damage and bring its pilot home. When the P-47D arrived in the Pacific in late 1943, pilots initially resented it. It was heavy, less maneuverable than the Japanese fighters, and it drank fuel at a prodigious rate. But the P-47 had virtues that mattered in ground attack. It could carry 2,500 pounds of external stores, it could absorb tremendous battle damage, and its 8.50 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. By 1944, the P-47 had become the primary ground attack fighter in the Pacific, and its pilots had become something the doctrine writers never anticipated, not knights of the air engaging in honorable combat, but executioners flying low over jungles and beaches, deciding who lived and who died. The training that produced pilots like Hartley reflected this reality. Flight school taught aerodynamics, navigation, and aerial gunnery. Advanced training taught formation flying, instrument procedures, and combat tactics, but nothing taught the moral calculus of ground attack. The briefings were clear. You are authorized to engage military targets. Enemy personnel are military targets. Structures that may house enemy personnel are military targets. Vehicles, boats, animals that may be used for military transport are targets. The definitions were broad because war is not a legal seminar, and pilots cannot conduct investigations at 300 knots. The underlying assumption was that if you see it in a combat zone and it might be hostile, you are authorized to destroy it. This assumption rested on a fundamental truth about air warfare. The pilot is isolated from the consequences of his actions in ways that infantry soldiers are not. An infantryman sees the face of the man he shoots. He hears the screams. He smells the blood. He cannot pretend that the enemy is an abstraction. But a pilot, even one flying low-level attack missions, experiences combat through the mediation of speed and distance. Targets are shapes in a gun sight. Explosions are observed from above, and the pilot moves on before the smoke clears. This psychological distance makes killing easier, and easier killing makes pilots more effective. The military understands this. It trains pilots to think in terms of targets, not people, because pilots who think about people hesitate, and hesitation in combat kills you. Hartley was trained not to think. He was trained to react, to follow procedures, to execute his mission. And for 86 missions, that training held. He dropped his bombs, he fired his guns, and if he thought about the people on the receiving end, he did not think about them for long. But training is preparation for situations you can anticipate. No one had prepared him for the man on the beach.
The Pacific Theater in 1944 operates under different rules than the war in Europe. There are no neat lines of trench warfare, no Gothic cathedrals to spare. No ancient cities where combatants and civilians can be cleanly separated. Here, war is islands and atolls, jungle and coral, and the endless blue of an ocean that swallows evidence. It is also a war where the codes of conduct learned in training begin to bend under the weight of necessity, isolation, and a brutality that both sides practice and suffer. The fighter pilot does not arrive at this beach by accident. He arrives there through a chain of tactical decisions, strategic imperatives, and the simple mathematics of fuel, ammunition, and mission objectives. But mathematics cannot explain what happens when he sees the man below and chooses not to fire. First Lieutenant Robert Eugene Hartley does not look like a man burdened by philosophy when he wakes at 0430 hours on the morning of September 17, 1944, at Tacloban Airstrip on Leyte. He looks like what he is, a 23-year-old from Terre Haute, Indiana, who has flown 87 combat sorties in 7 months, who has learned to sleep through the sound of Japanese artillery, and who can field strip a Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun blindfolded, because the difference between functioning and jammed weapons is the difference between a pilot who returns and one who does not. He has been assigned to the 49th Fighter Group, 7th Fighter Squadron, flying the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, one of the heaviest single-seat fighters ever deployed in the Pacific. The P-47D weighs 17,500 pounds fully loaded, mounts 8 .50 caliber machine guns with 3,400 rounds of ammunition total, and can carry either 2 1,000-pound bombs or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets under its wings. It is not built for dogfighting Zeros. It is built for ground attack, for what the pilots call mud moving, the systematic destruction of enemy infrastructure, supply lines, and personnel. Hartley's mission briefing at 0515 hours is routine in the way that only prolonged war can make routine. The target? A suspected Japanese staging area on the northern coast of Samar Island, approximately 140 miles northeast of Tacloban. Intelligence reports indicate a battalion strength force, possibly remnants of the 16th Division retreating from Leyte's interior, attempting to consolidate for evacuation or reinforcement. The mission is armed reconnaissance with extreme prejudice. Pilots are authorized to engage any military-age males, any structures that could house troops or supplies, and vessels capable of transport. The rules of engagement are clear. Everything is a target until proven otherwise, and there is no mechanism in a fighter cockpit to prove otherwise. Hartley climbs into his P-47D at 0600 hours. The aircraft's call sign is Hoosier Queen, named not for any woman, but for the state he has not seen in 18 months. The ground crew has loaded all 8 guns, topped off the fuel tanks, and hung 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs under the wings. The bombs are fitted with instantaneous fuses, designed to detonate on contact rather than penetration, maximizing fragmentation effect against soft targets like personnel and wooden structures. The technical specifications of his weapon system are precise and unforgiving. Each of the 8 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns is belt-fed, with 4 guns mounted in each wing, synchronized to converge at a point approximately 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. The rate of fire for all 8 guns combined is approximately 800 rounds per minute, though in practice pilots fire in bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent overheating. Each 50 caliber round is 5.45 inches long and weighs 1.6 ounces, with a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. The projectile is a hardened steel penetrator encased in a copper-plated jacket designed to punch through aircraft aluminum and light armor. Against human tissue, the effect is catastrophic. The bullet does not simply pierce, it tears, creating wound channels several inches in diameter as the projectile tumbles in fragments. Military physicians who treated casualties from 50 caliber fire reported that survival was unlikely if the bullet struck the torso or head, and even extremity hits often resulted in amputations due to the massive tissue destruction.
Hartley knows these specifications not from manuals but from experience. He has seen what his guns do to aircraft, the way a 1-second burst can shred a Zero's wing or explode its fuel tank. He has seen what happens to ground targets, the way a burst into a truck creates a fountain of debris, or a burst into a structure turns wood and thatch into splinters. He has never seen, up close, what his guns do to a human being, and he is grateful for that ignorance. The distance preserves it. From 500 feet at 250 knots, you see the target, you fire, you pull up, and you do not see the aftermath. The next pilot in line might see it, but by then it is just something that was destroyed, not someone who died. Hartley runs through his pre-flight checklist with the mechanical precision of repetition: magnetos, mixture, prop pitch, flaps, trim, gun switches.
The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine coughs to life, its 2,000 horsepower turning the four-blade propeller into a wall of noise that makes conversation impossible. The engine is a masterpiece of American engineering, an 18-cylinder, twin-row radial that produces its power through controlled explosions occurring 1,350 times per minute. It burns 100-octane aviation gasoline at a rate of 100 gallons per hour at full throttle, though cruise settings reduce that to approximately 60 gallons per hour. The P-47D carries 305 gallons internally, plus up to 375 additional gallons in external drop tanks, giving it a combat radius of approximately 500 miles. These numbers matter because they determine what missions are possible, how long a pilot can remain over the target area, and whether he has the fuel to reach an alternate landing field if his primary is under attack. Hartley does not think about what he is about to do. Thinking is for after, if there is an after. The flight consists of 4 P-47Ds in a loose finger 4 formation, a tactical arrangement developed early in the war to maximize mutual support and visibility. Hartley flies as number 3, on the right wing of his flight leader, Captain Ernest Wade, a 28-year-old Texan who has 14 confirmed aerial victories and the kind of calm competence that keeps young pilots alive. They take off at 0630 hours, lifting heavily into air thick with humidity and the residual smoke from morning cooking fires in the Filipino villages that ring the airstrip. The flight climbs to 8,000 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire, low enough to identify targets without prolonged exposure. The weather is what the meteorologists call CAVU, ceiling invisibility unlimited, which means there will be no clouds to hide in and no excuses for missing. The flight reaches the target area at 0715 hours. The northern coast of Samar is a patchwork of jungle, rocky niche, and small inlets where rivers meet the Pacific. From 8,000 feet, it looks peaceful, even beautiful, the kind of tropical paradise that travel posters promise and war destroys. The tactical situation on Samar in September 1944 was complex. The island had been under Japanese occupation since 1942, and the occupying forces consisted primarily of elements of the 16th Division, supplemented by naval support personnel and construction units. By September 1944, these forces were in retreat, withdrawing from interior positions as American forces advanced through Leyte and prepared for the assault on Luzon. The retreating Japanese troops were attempting to consolidate on the coast, where they could be evacuated by submarine or fast transport to defend more critical positions. American air power was tasked with interdicting these movements, destroying the troops before they could be evacuated, and denying the Japanese the use of coastal areas for resupply or reinforcement. This mission of interdiction created unique challenges. Unlike attacking fixed installations or large formations, interdiction required finding small, dispersed groups of enemy personnel who were often hidden in terrain that provided excellent concealment. Intelligence was fragmentary. Reports came from Filipino guerrillas, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and radio intercepts, but the information was rarely precise. A report might indicate enemy activity in a given area, but it could not specify the number of troops, their intentions, or their exact locations. Pilots were expected to locate targets opportunistically, using their own judgment to determine what constituted a legitimate military target.
This requirement for judgment placed enormous responsibility on individual pilots. A battalion commander planning an infantry assault had staff officers, maps, intelligence reports, and time to analyze the situation. A pilot in a fighter aircraft had seconds to observe, assess, and decide. The consequences of error were significant. Attacking a genuine military target saved American lives, but attacking civilians killed innocents and potentially created enemies among the Filipino population that American forces were trying to liberate. There was no perfect solution, only the least bad option chosen in the moment. Wade calls out landmarks over the radio, his voice flat and professional. Eyes on the inlet, 2 o'clock. Structures visible, count 4, possibly more in the tree line. Smoke from fires, likely cooking. No visible defensive positions, no flak, no movement yet. This is the paradox of ground attack missions in the Pacific. They are often more dangerous before you commit than during the attack itself. Once you dive, once you pickle your bombs or open fire with your guns, the momentum of combat takes over, and there is no time for doubt. But before the dive, there are seconds, sometimes minutes, where a pilot can see everything and must decide what everything means.
Hartley sees the structures Wade described. They are not barracks or bunkers. They are native huts with thatched roofs and walls of woven bamboo, the kind that Filipino civilians have lived in for centuries, and that Japanese troops appropriate whenever they need shelter. He sees the smoke, thin columns rising lazily in the still morning air, and he knows that smoke means people, but not whether those people wear uniforms or not. He sees the inlet, the small crescent beach where jungle meets water, and he sees movement now, figures emerging from the tree line, perhaps 10 or 12, too far to distinguish details. Wade's voice crackles again. Flight, this is lead, rolling in on the structures. Number 2, take the northern cluster. 3 and 4, stand by for secondary targets. Watch for ground fire. The first P-47 rolls into its attack dive, Wade's aircraft dropping nose first toward the Earth, accelerating from 200 knots to over 400 in seconds. The P-47 is stable in a dive, almost comforting in how it tracks straight and true, but the G-forces compress the pilot into his seat, and the air shrieking past the canopy makes it sound like the plane is tearing itself apart, even though it is not. Wade's bombs release at 2,000 feet, 2 black shapes tumbling away, and he pulls up hard, the Thunderbolt's massive wings bending visibly under the strain. The bombs impact 2 seconds later. The explosions are sharp and bright even in daylight, twin geysers of dirt, wood, and thatch that collapse 2 of the structures immediately. The shockwaves ripple through the jungle canopy, shaking leaves loose, and the smoke that was thin and white turns thick and black as something, food stores, fuel, fabric, begins to burn. Number 2 follows, and then it is Hartley's turn. He rolls into his dive at 07:18 hours, and the world narrows to the gun sight, the altimeter, and the target area rushing up. He has done this 87 times before. He knows the sequence: align, dive, check altitude, pickle bombs at 2,000 feet, pull out by 1,500 feet, or the blast from your own ordnance can damage your aircraft. He knows that in combat, time compresses and expands simultaneously, that seconds feel like minutes in the dive, and then suddenly you're pulling out and the dive is already memory. His bombs release clean. He feels the aircraft lurch as 1,000 pounds of weight drops away, and he pulls back on the stick, the G-force is graying his vision at the edges, and he sees his bombs impact on the southern edge of the cluster, destroying what looks like a supply shed or small storage building. Wade's voice comes again. Good hits, good hits. 3, make your strafing pass on the beach area. I've got personnel in the open heading for tree cover. Light them up.
This is the moment when flying and killing intersect. Dropping bombs is abstract, mechanical. You aim at a structure, a grid coordinate, an objective. But strafing is personal. The gun sight is only 30 inches in front of your eyes, and the target fills it completely. And there is no pretending that the shapes in the pipper are anything but human beings who will die if you fire. Hartley brings the P-47 around, descending now to 500 feet, speed bleeding off to 250 knots, the ideal parameters for a strafing pass. He can see the beach clearly now, the figures running, and his finger moves to the gun trigger on the control stick. The trigger is a simple button, black plastic worn smooth by use, and it requires only 4 pounds of pressure to activate. 4 pounds to send 3,400 rounds of .5 caliber ammunition down range at a rate of 800 rounds per minute combined across all 8 guns. Each bullet weighs approximately 1.6 ounces and travels at 2,900 feet per second. The effect on human tissue is catastrophic and well documented in medical reports that Hartley has never read and never will. He lines up his run. The figures on the beach are clearer now. 11 men, running in different directions, some toward the jungle, others toward the water, as if the ocean might offer cover. Hartley's training takes over, his hands and feet making micro-adjustments to keep the aircraft stable, his eyes tracking movement, his finger tightening on the trigger. And then he sees one figure who is not running. The man stands near the waterline, perhaps 60 feet from the tree line, and he is looking up. He wears dark clothing, possibly a uniform, possibly civilian clothes that have faded to the same nondescript color that everything in the tropics eventually becomes. He is not holding a weapon. Hartley can see that clearly now at 400 feet and closing. The man's hands are at his sides. He is simply standing, and in the 2 seconds before Hartley's P-47 roars overhead, the man does not dive for cover. He does not raise his arms in surrender. He simply stands and watches the aircraft approach, and Hartley sees his face. He does not fire. His finger, tensed against the trigger, does not complete the 4 pounds of pressure required. The P-47 thunders over the beach, its shadow racing across the sand, the sound of the engine so loud that it drowns out everything else, and the 8.5 caliber machine guns remain silent. Hartley pulls up, climbing back to altitude, and his radio crackles. 3, did you have a malfunction? I saw no fire. Hartley's voice when he responds is steady. Negative lead, no hostile action observed, target area appears to be civilian. It is a lie. Or perhaps it is not. Hartley does not know if the man on the beach is a soldier or a civilian, Japanese or Filipino, armed or unarmed beyond what he could see in those 2 seconds. What he knows is that he saw a man standing defenseless and chose not to kill him. Wade does not question it. Combat decisions are made in instants, and flight leaders learn not to second-guess their pilots on judgment calls unless there's clear evidence of cowardice or incompetence. The flight makes one more pass, Wade and number 2 strafing the jungle tree line where most of the figures disappeared, the .5 caliber rounds chewing through vegetation and raising puffs of dirt and coral. Then they climb out, forming up at 10,000 feet, and turn southwest toward Tacloban. The mission has lasted 14 minutes. Hartley's aircraft has expended 2 500-pound bombs and 0 rounds of ammunition. Back at Tacloban, the after-action debriefing is routine. Wade reports successful strikes on enemy staging area, structures destroyed, estimated casualties between 8 and 12 enemy personnel. Hartley signs the report. The intelligence officer asks no follow-up questions. The war does not pause for philosophical inquiry, and there are 60 more missions scheduled for tomorrow. But that night, lying on his cot in the stifling heat of his tent, Hartley cannot stop seeing the man on the beach. The way he stood, the way he looked up, the fact that Hartley did not fire, and the question that arises from that fact. Did he refuse to kill an unarmed man because it was the right thing to do, or because in that instant he simply could not bring himself to do it? The war gives him no time to answer. In October, the 49th Fighter Group supports the Lady Gulf landings, flying close air support for the invasion force. Hartley flies 23 sorties in 11 days, dropping bombs on Japanese artillery positions, strafing supply convoys, and twice engaging Japanese fighters that attempt to interfere with American bombers. He shoots down 1-0 over Taloban Harbor, watching the enemy aircraft spiral into the water, and he feels nothing about it. The Zero's pilot bailed out and survived, captured by Filipino guerrillas an hour later, but Hartley does not learn this until after the war. He continues to fly. November brings missions over Mindoro. December brings Christmas and a 3-day stand-down where pilots are issued 2 beers each and a USO show that consists of 3 Filipino musicians and a tired comedian from Sacramento. Hartley drinks both beers and does not laugh at the jokes. In January 1945, the 49th Fighter Group moves to Mindoro Airstrip, closer to the fighting in Luzon. The missions grow longer and more dangerous as Japanese air defenses consolidate around Manila. Hartley flies cover for B-24 bombing raids, escorts C-47 transport flights, and continues ground attack missions against Japanese positions that are now dug in and fortified. On February 3, 1945, his P-47 takes a 20mm cannon round through the left wing during a strafing run near San Fernando. The round does not explode, passing clean through the wing structure and exiting through the top surface, but the damage to the hydraulics requires an emergency landing at Clark Field. Hartley walks away without injury. The aircraft is repaired and back in service 3 days later. He reaches 200 combat sorties on March 11, 1945. He is awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters for meritorious achievement in aerial flight during combat operations. The citations are generic, the language identical to thousands of others, but the medals are real, and the danger they represent is real. By March 1945, more than 4,500 American pilots have been killed or gone missing in the Pacific Theater. Hartley knows the statistics. He also knows that statistics mean nothing when you were the one flying the mission. The war in Europe ends in May. The war in the Pacific does not. Hartley continues to fly. June brings missions over Formosa, striking Japanese airfields in preparation for the planned invasion of Japan. July brings rumors of a new weapon, something the pilots hear whispered but do not understand. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. On August 9th, another destroys Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrenders. Hartley is at Okinawa when the announcement comes, waiting to launch on a mission that is suddenly canceled.
The pilots stand on the flight line, uncertain what to do, and then someone starts cheering, and the cheering spreads, and they realize it is over. Hartley flies his last combat mission on August 13, 1945, 2 days before the surrender, a patrol over the East China Sea that encounters no enemy aircraft and no enemy fire. He lands at Okinawa at 15:30 hours, taxis to his revetment, shuts down the engine, and climbs out. He has flown 247 combat sorties. He has dropped over 50 tons of bombs. He has fired more than 20,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. He has shot down 2 enemy aircraft and damaged 3 others. He's been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 5 oak leaf clusters, and the Presidential Unit Citation. He has never been wounded. He returns to the United States in November 1945, processed through a demobilization center in San Francisco, and receives his discharge papers in December. He is 24 years old. He goes back to Terre Haute. He enrolls at Indiana State Teachers College under the GI Bill, majoring in history because he cannot think of anything else to do. The transition from combat pilot to college student is jarring in ways he does not anticipate. His classmates are younger, many of them fresh out of high school, and they talk about parties and football games and concerns that seem trivial to someone who has spent the last 2 years wondering if each morning will be his last. There are other veterans on campus, men who served in Europe or the Pacific, and they recognize each other without speaking, a shared look that says, "I was there, and you cannot explain it to anyone who was not." Hartley makes few friends. He attends his classes, completes his assignments, and spends his free time in the library reading histories of wars that feel safer because they happened long ago and to other people.
He graduates in 1949, takes a job teaching high school history in Indianapolis, marries a woman named Dorothy whom he met in a class on American government, and settles into a life that from the outside looks entirely normal. The normalcy is deliberate. Hartley constructs it carefully, brick by brick, a life with schedules and routines and predictable outcomes. He teaches 5 classes a day, 5 days a week. He grades papers in the evening. He attends church on Sunday. He mows his lawn on Saturday mornings. He does not talk about the war unless asked directly. And when he is asked, his answers are brief and factual. Yes, he flew fighters. Yes, he was in the Pacific. Yes, it was dangerous. No, he does not like to dwell on it. Dorothy is patient with his silences. She recognizes that there are parts of him she cannot reach, rooms in his mind where the door is closed and locked. She does not push. They have children, a son born in 1952 and a daughter in 1955, and Hartley is a good father in the ways that matter, present, attentive, rarely angry. The children do not know their father was a war hero because Hartley does not tell them, and Dorothy does not emphasize it. The medals stay in a box in the back of a closet. The photographs of his P-47 are filed away. The war is the past, and Hartley works very hard to keep it there. But he cannot forget the man on the beach. The memory returns at unpredictable times. Sometimes it is triggered by something obvious, a news report about the Pacific War, a student asking about his service, a film showing fighter aircraft in a dive. Other times it comes without warning, surfacing in the middle of a lesson on the Reconstruction, or while he is grading papers or eating dinner. He sees the man standing near the waterline, looking up, and he feels again the weight of the decision not to fire. In the years immediately after the war, he tries to rationalize it. The man was unarmed. The man might have been a civilian. The rules of engagement, while broad, did not technically require him to fire on individuals who posed no immediate threat. These are the justifications he constructs, and they satisfy him for a while. But by the 1950s, the rationalization begins to erode. Hartley reads books about the war, memoirs by other pilots, historical analyses of air combat. He learns details he did not know or did not think about during the war. He learns that the Japanese forces on Samar in September 1944 consisted primarily of infantry from the 16th Division, combat troops who were armed and engaged in military operations. He learns that the area where he flew his mission was not a civilian area, but a known Japanese staging point. He learns that in the larger context of the battle for the Philippines, every Japanese soldier left alive was a soldier who would fight again, kill again, prolong the war. And he begins to question whether his decision not to fire was an act of mercy or an act of cowardice. The question haunts him not because he believes he should have killed the man, but because he cannot determine with certainty whether his choice was moral or merely emotional.
In war, soldiers are expected to follow orders, to fulfill their mission, to eliminate the enemy. Hartley's mission was to attack enemy personnel. He saw enemy personnel and did not attack. By the strictest definition, he failed in his duty. But duty is an abstraction. The man on the beach was not. Hartley does not talk about this with anyone. His wife knows he served, knows he flew fighters in the Pacific, but she does not ask for details and he does not offer them. His students know he is a veteran, and occasionally one will ask what it was like to fly in combat. And he will say it was loud and frightening and necessary, and the student will nod and the moment will pass. His friends from the war, the few he stays in contact with, do not discuss their missions in any specific detail. There is a shared understanding among combat veterans that certain things are not discussed not because they are secret, but because they are impossible to explain to anyone who was not there. In 1962, Hartley's son asks him if he ever killed anyone in the war. The boy is 12, curious, and has been reading a book about fighter races. Hartley thinks about the question for a long time. He thinks about the 2 Zeros he shot down, knowing that at least one pilot died when his aircraft hit the water. He thinks about the bombs he dropped, the structures he destroyed, the strafing runs he made after that day in September 1944, the figures he saw running or falling in his gun sight. He thinks about the man on the beach who stood and did not run. And he answers, yes.
The boy asks, how many? And Hartley says, I don't know, which is the truth. The boy says, was it hard? And Hartley says, yes, which is also the truth, though not in the way the boy probably imagines. The boy seems satisfied and goes back to his book. Hartley goes to his study and closes the door. The 1960s and 1970s bring the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War brings a new generation of pilots and a new cultural conversation about war and killing. Hartley watches the debates on television, reads the editorials in newspapers, listens to his students argue about the morality of military action. The arguments are passionate and often simplistic, framed in absolutes that Hartley knows do not exist in combat. War is not a moral proposition. War is a series of impossible choices made by people who are frightened and exhausted and trying to survive. But he does not say this aloud, because he knows it will sound like a justification, and he is not sure it is one. In 1974, Hartley retires from teaching at the age of 53. He and Dorothy move to a small house outside Bloomington, and he spends his time reading, gardening, and occasionally attending reunions of the 49th Fighter Group. The reunions are subdued affairs, mostly older men drinking beer and reminiscing about the war in the careful, edited way that veterans do, emphasizing the camaraderie and the mechanical challenges and the occasional moments of dark humor. No one talks about killing. No one talks about the men they saw die. No one talks about the choices they made that they still do not understand. At the 1976 reunion in San Antonio, Hartley meets a historian from the University of Texas who is writing a book about fighter operations in the Philippines. The historian interviews several pilots, asking detailed questions about tactics, aircraft performance, and specific missions. When he asks Hartley about ground attack operations, he describes the procedures, the altitude for bomb release, the angle of strafing runs, the way you judge distance by the size of objects in your gun sight. The historian takes notes and asks, "Did you ever have difficulty identifying targets?" And Hartley pauses for a long time before answering, "Yes." The historian waits for elaboration, but Hartley does not provide it, and eventually the interview moves on to other topics. Later, when the book is published in 1978, Hartley appears in it briefly, identified as First Lieutenant Robert Hartley, 49th Fighter Group, 247 combat missions. There is no mention of the man on the beach, because Hartley did not mention him. The difficulty with carrying a secret is that it grows heavier over time. What starts as a private memory becomes an obsession, and the obsession becomes a defining characteristic, even if no one else can see it. By the late 1970s, Hartley's obsession with the incident on the beach has begun to affect his daily life in ways that Dorothy notices but does not understand. He becomes withdrawn, distracted, prone to long silences where he stares at nothing and does not respond when spoken to. He has trouble sleeping. He begins to have what he calls episodes,
Moments where he is suddenly back in the cockpit of his P-47, diving toward the beach, his finger on the trigger, and he experiences again the decision not to fire with a vividness that makes his hands shake. The episodes last only seconds, but they leave him exhausted. Dorothy finally asks him in the spring of 1981 what is wrong. They are sitting on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the trees, and she says, "You're not here anymore. Where are you?" And Hartley tries to explain. He tells her about the mission, about the man on the beach, about the fact that he did not fire and has never understood why. He expects her to say he did the right thing, or to say it does not matter, or to offer some form of comfort. Instead, she asks, "Do you think he would have killed you if your positions were reversed?" And Hartley says, "I don't know." And Dorothy says, "Then perhaps that's your answer." It is not an answer, not really, but it is the beginning of one. The question is not whether the man on the beach would have shown mercy. The question is why Hartley did, and whether that mercy was a virtue or a weakness. These are different questions, and the difference matters. In 1982, Hartley is 61 years old. He is in good health, financially secure, and by all external measures, has lived a successful and fulfilling life. But he cannot stop thinking about the man on the beach. The memory, which for years surfaced sporadically, now comes almost daily. He dreams about it. He wakes in the middle of the night and sees the man standing near the waterline, looking up, and Hartley thinks, "I could have killed you, but I did not, and I do not understand why." He decides he needs to know.
In October 1982, Hartley begins research. He writes letters to the National Archives requesting mission records from the 49th Fighter Group. He contacts the Air Force Historical Research Agency asking for after-action reports from September 1944. He joins a veterans organization that publishes a newsletter and places an ad asking for anyone who served in the 7th Fighter Squadron and remembers missions over Samar. The responses are slow and often unhelpful. Mission records from 1944 are incomplete. Many were lost or destroyed. The reports that do survive are vague, written in the abbreviated language of military bureaucracy. Armed reconnaissance mission executed, targets engaged, results observed, no friendly casualties. But Hartley persists. He finds Captain Ernest Wade, his former flight leader, now a retired lieutenant colonel living in Dallas. He calls Wade and they talk for 2 hours. Wade remembers the mission, or at least he remembers missions like it because there were hundreds of them and they blur together. Wade says, "We did what we were ordered to do. We destroyed enemy capability. That was the job." Hartley asks, "Do you remember a mission where I reported no hostile action?" And Wade pauses and says, "I remember you were a good pilot. I remember you came home. That's what mattered." It is not the answer Hartley needs. He writes to Filipino historical societies, asking if there are records of Japanese troop movements in Samar in September 1944. He receives polite responses in a few documents, mostly in Tagalog, which he has translated by a colleague at Indiana University. The documents confirm what he already knew. Japanese forces were present in the area, retreating from American advances, using coastal villages for shelter and resupply. There is no specific mention of the inlet where Hartley flew his mission. There are no names. In 1984, Hartley receives a letter from a man named Takashi Yamamoto, a former soldier in the 16th Division. Yamamoto had seen Hartley's inquiry reprinted in a Japanese veterans newsletter, translated and circulated among former IJA personnel. Yamamoto writes, in careful English, that he was in Samar in September 1944 as part of a detachment assigned to coordinate the evacuation of wounded soldiers. He remembers American air attacks. He remembers many men dying. He does not remember a specific incident of an aircraft that did not fire, but he says that such things did happen, sometimes, and when they did, the men believed it was because the pilot had run out of ammunition or had mechanical problems. "We did not think American pilots spared us," Yamamoto writes. "We thought we were lucky." Hartley writes back. The correspondence continues, slowly,
across the Pacific and across the barriers of language and history. Yamamoto is cautious at first, then more open. He describes the conditions in Samar, the hunger, the disease, the constant fear of air attack. He describes the sound of American engines, the P-47s and P-38s, and how the men learned to recognize each aircraft by sound alone. He describes watching friends die, bodies torn apart by .50 caliber fire and the impossibility of burial or proper rites. He describes the day the war ended and the strange mix of relief and shame that came with surrender. Hartley asks Yamamoto if he knows of anyone who survived an encounter with an American fighter on the northern coast of Samar on September 17, 1944. Yamamoto does not. He says many men survived many encounters, or perhaps the same man survived many times, and without specific details it is impossible to know. He says the war was very large. One man is very small. Perhaps the man you saw is dead now. Perhaps he died later in the war. Perhaps he survived and went home and never spoke of it. This is what many of us did. It is not the answer Hartley hoped for, but it is an honest one. The correspondence continues for 2 more years. Yamamoto and Hartley exchanged letters about their lives after the war, their families, their memories. They do not become friends exactly. The gap is too large. But they develop a kind of mutual respect, a shared understanding that they were both participants in something larger than themselves and smaller than history. In 1986, Yamamoto dies of heart disease at the age of 64. His son writes to Hartley to inform him. The son includes a photograph of Yamamoto in his later years, an older man in a suit, smiling slightly, standing in a garden. The son's letter, written in careful English, says, "My father spoke of you often in his final years. He said that the war made enemies of men who should have been friends, and that letters like yours proved that the war did not have to define us forever. He hoped you had found peace."
Hartley reads the letter 3 times. He examines the photograph, looking for something he cannot name in Yamamoto's face. He thinks about the fact that Yamamoto was in Samar in September 1944, that he might have known the man on the beach, that he might have been the man on the beach, though the timeline does not quite align, and Hartley knows it. He writes a response to Yamamoto's son, thanking him for the letter, expressing condolences, and saying that his correspondence with Yamamoto had been meaningful. He does not mention the man on the beach in the letter because he realizes that Yamamoto's son would not understand, just as his own children do not understand, just as perhaps no one can understand except the man himself, and the man is either dead or unreachable. Hartley places the photograph in a folder with the letters and closes it. He does not find the man on the beach. He realizes, eventually, that he never will. The realization does not bring peace. It brings something else. An acceptance that some questions cannot be answered, not because the answers do not exist, but because the circumstances that created the questions were too complex, too transient, too entangled in the chaos of war to ever be fully reconstructed. The man on the beach was real. The moment was real. But the meaning of the moment is something Hartley must construct alone, without verification, without confirmation, without the comfort of knowing he was right. The man could be anyone. He could have been a soldier, a civilian, a cook, a medic, a scout. He could have been Japanese or Filipino or even Korean, as many Koreans were conscripted into Japanese labor battalions in the Pacific. He could have been 18 or 40. He could have had a family or been alone. He could have died minutes after Hartley's aircraft passed overhead, killed by one of the other planes in the flight, or he could have survived the war and lived another 50 years. There is no way to know. What Hartley does know, finally, is that the question he has been asking for 40 years is the wrong question. The question is not, why didn't I fire? The question is, what does it mean that I did not? In 1987, Hartley writes a letter that he does not send. He writes it to the man on the beach, whoever he was, wherever he is. The letter says, "I saw you on September 17, 1944.
You were standing near the water and you looked up at my aircraft. I was ordered to engage enemy personnel, and you appeared to be enemy personnel. I could have killed you in less than a second. I did not. I have spent 40 years trying to understand why, and I have concluded that there is no why. There is only the fact. I saw a human being who was defenseless, and I chose not to end his life. I do not know if this was courage or cowardice, mercy or weakness. I do not know if you were an enemy soldier or a civilian, if you survived or died. If you ever thought about that moment again, I know only that I think about it, and I think perhaps that is the point. War asks us to kill without thinking. I thought. I do not know if that makes me a good soldier or a bad one, but I know it makes me a human being. He does not send the letter because there is no address. He files it with the photographs and the correspondence and the mission records. He does not speak of it again. Hartley dies in March 1992 at the age of 71 of complications from pneumonia. His obituary in the Bloomington Herald-Times mentions his service in World War II, his teaching career, his wife and 2 children and 5 grandchildren. It does not mention the man on the beach. At his funeral, a representative from the 49th Fighter Group presents Dorothy with a folding American flag and thanks her for her husband's service. Several of Hartley's former students attend, now middle-aged themselves, and they speak of him as a teacher who made history feel real, who taught them that events in textbooks were made of individual choices by individual people. After the funeral, Dorothy goes through Hartley's papers. She finds the folder with the letters from Yamamoto, the mission records, the unsent letter, and a photograph of a P-47D Thunderbolt that she recognizes from pictures Hartley kept but never displayed. She reads the unsent letter. She sits for a long time. Then she places everything back in the folder and puts it on a shelf, and she does not throw it away. The story, such as it is, ends there. Or perhaps it does not end at all. The man on the beach remains unknown. The reason Hartley did not fire remains unclear. The war continues to echo in the choices made and not made, in the lives saved and ended, in the memories that haunt and the memories that fade.
What remains is the fact. On September 17, 1944, in the middle of a war that killed millions, one pilot saw one man and chose not to kill him. It was not a strategic decision. It did not change the outcome of the battle or the war. It did not make Hartley a hero or a coward. It made him something else. A man who, for reasons he could never fully articulate, refused to kill an unarmed person and who carried that refusal for the rest of his life. The Pacific War was fought with extraordinary brutality on all sides. Prisoners were executed. Civilians were killed in crossfire and deliberate targeting. Cities were firebombed. The atomic bomb was used twice. The moral complexity of those actions is the subject of endless debate, and rightly so. But within that vast and terrible conflict, there were moments, small and uncounted, where individuals made choices that defied the logic of war. Hartley's choice was one of them. In the years after the war, the debate over what constitutes ethical conduct in combat has continued and evolved. The Geneva Conventions, expanded and clarified, codify protections for prisoners, civilians, and wounded combatants. The laws of armed conflict attempt to place boundaries on violence. But laws and conventions are abstractions. In the moment, in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft diving toward a target at 400 miles per hour, there are no lawyers, no ethicists, no time for deliberation. There is only the pilot, the target, and the trigger. Hartley's story raises questions that remain relevant. What is the responsibility of a soldier to obey orders versus the responsibility to make moral judgments? When does adherence to rules of engagement become complicity in atrocity? When does refusal to engage become a dereliction of duty? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that every combatant must answer for themselves, often in seconds, and live with forever. The literature on combat psychology documents extensively the toll that killing takes on soldiers, even when that killing is legal, justified, and necessary. Studies of World War II veterans reveal rates of post-traumatic stress that were not recognized or treated at the time.
Pilots who flew bombing missions over Germany report nightmares decades later. Infantry soldiers who fought in the Pacific describe survivor's guilt, moral injury, and the inability to reconcile the person they were with the things they did. Hartley's experience fits this pattern. He did not suffer from traditional PTSD in the sense of flashbacks to moments of danger or fear. He suffered from moral injury, the wound inflicted not by what was done to him, but by what he did, or in his case, did not do, and could not reconcile with his sense of who he was. The concept of moral injury is relatively recent in military psychology, but the experience is as old as war itself. It describes the damage to a person's moral foundation when they witness, participate in, or fail to prevent actions that violate their deeply held beliefs about right and wrong. For Hartley, the injury came not from killing, but from the act of choosing not to kill, and then spending 40 years questioning whether that choice was right. The injury came from the burden of moral agency in a context designed to strip that agency away. In the broader scope of the Pacific War, Hartley's mission on September 17, 1944, was insignificant. The after-action report noted structures destroyed and estimated enemy casualties, and the information was filed and forgotten. The battle for the Philippines continued. The 49th Fighter Group flew thousands more sorties. The war ground on for another 11 months, consuming hundreds of thousands more lives until the atomic bombs and the Japanese surrender brought it to a close. One pilot's decision not to fire on one man on one beach changed none of that. But it changed Hartley. It changed him in ways he did not understand for years, perhaps did not fully understand ever. It gave him a question he could not answer and a memory he could not escape. It made him wonder, for the rest of his life, whether the choices we make in war define us, or whether we define ourselves by how we live with those choices afterward. The man on the beach, if he survived, never knew that he was spared. He never knew that a pilot saw him, decided not to fire, and carried that decision for 40 years. He went on with his life, or he did not. And the moment that defined Hartley's existence was, for him, just another moment in a war full of moments where death arrived randomly or did not arrive at all. This asymmetry is part of what haunted Hartley. The man on the beach was not burdened by the encounter. Only Hartley was.
There's a theory in philosophy called moral luck, which explores the idea that we judge actions not only by intent and choice, but by outcomes that are often beyond our control. A driver who runs a red light and hits no one is judged less harshly than a driver who runs the same red light and kills a pedestrian, even though the moral quality of the action, running the red light, is identical. Hartley's case is an inversion of this. He chose not to act, and the outcome, whatever happened to the man on the beach, was beyond his knowledge, and therefore he could never assess whether his choice was right or wrong by its results. He was left only with the choice itself, stripped of context and forced to evaluate it in isolation. Perhaps that is the real lesson of Hartley's story. War forces people to make choices under conditions where moral clarity is impossible. We can codify rules, train soldiers, establish conventions, but we cannot eliminate the moments where a human being must decide, alone and in seconds, what kind of person they will be. Hartley decided he could not kill an unarmed man, even though that man might be his enemy, even though his mission required it, even though refusing might constitute failure. He made that decision and lived with it, and the living with it was harder than the decision itself. The legal and ethical framework governing Hartley's actions in 1944 was defined primarily by the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. Supplemented by customary international law and the military codes of conduct of the combatant nations. The conventions prohibited the killing of enemy combatants who had surrendered or were incapacitated, and they provided protections for civilians who were not taking part in hostilities. But the conventions contained a critical ambiguity. They did not clearly define what constituted taking part in hostilities in the context of total war,
where entire populations might be mobilized for war production, where every civilian might be a potential combatant, and where the distinction between military and civilian targets became increasingly blurred. In the Pacific War, this ambiguity was compounded by the nature of the conflict. Japanese military doctrine encouraged civilian resistance and the use of irregular forces. Japanese soldiers frequently wore civilian clothing or used civilian structures for military purposes. American forces, operating in territory where they could not easily distinguish friend from foe, adopted increasingly broad definitions of legitimate targets. The result was a war where the protections theoretically afforded by international law eroded in practice, replaced by operational necessities and the assumption that anyone in a combat zone who was not clearly identified as friendly was presumed hostile. Hartley operated within this legal gray zone. His mission orders authorized him to engage military targets, and the definition of military targets included military-age males in areas known to be occupied by enemy forces. This definition was broad enough to encompass virtually anyone he might encounter, and narrow enough to provide legal cover if questions arose later. But legal authorization and moral justification are not identical. The law told Hartley what he was permitted to do. It did not tell him what he should do. The question of what he should do brings us to the concept of proportionality, a principle embedded in the laws of armed conflict but difficult to apply in practice. Proportionality requires that the military advantage gained from an attack must outweigh the harm caused to civilians or the humanitarian costs. Applied to Hartley's situation, the question becomes, what military advantage was gained by killing or not killing the man on the beach? If the man was a soldier, his death might prevent him from fighting again, from killing American soldiers, from prolonging the war. If he was a civilian, his death would serve no military purpose and would constitute, at best, a tragic mistake, at worst, a war crime. But Hartley could not determine which was true, and the law provided no guidance for how to resolve that uncertainty in the 3 seconds he had to decide. In the decades since World War II, the technology of warfare has evolved dramatically. Fighter pilots now launch missiles from beyond visual range. Drones strike targets from continents away, controlled by operators who return home to dinner after their shifts. The physical and temporal distance between attacker and target has grown, and with it, some argue, the moral distance as well. But the fundamental question remains. When you have the power to end a life and the authority to do so, what determines whether you should use that power?
Hartley had that power and that authority on September 17, 1944. He chose not to exercise it. 40 years later, he still did not know if he was right. Perhaps that uncertainty, that refusal to settle into comfortable certainty, is itself a kind of moral achievement. Perhaps the soldiers we should worry about are not the ones haunted by their choices, but the ones who never questioned them at all. The broader implications of Hartley's story extend beyond individual psychology to questions about how societies prepare for war and how they process the aftermath. Modern military training includes extensive instruction on the laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, and ethical decision-making under stress. Pilots are trained in simulators that can replicate almost any scenario, and they are taught to make split-second decisions based on doctrine and training. But no amount of training can fully prepare a person for the moral weight of taking a life, and no doctrine can eliminate the uncertainty that arises when the enemy is not clearly identifiable and the situation does not match the scenarios practiced in training. The psychological toll of combat, particularly combat that involves killing at close range or in ambiguous circumstances, has been extensively documented since World War II. The development of post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnostic category, the recognition of moral injury as distinct from PTSD, and the establishment of mental health services for veterans all reflect a growing understanding that war damages people in ways that are not always visible and not always tied to physical danger.
Hartley suffered no physical wounds in 247 combat missions, but the wound inflicted by his choice on September 17, 1944, was as real and as lasting as any injury caused by shrapnel or fire. This recognition has led to changes in how the military trains and supports its personnel. Modern fighter pilots receive not only technical training, but psychological preparation for the realities of combat. They are taught to recognize signs of stress, to seek help when needed, and to understand that moral complexity is an inherent feature of warfare, not a personal failing. Debriefings after missions now include discussions of ethical concerns, and pilots are encouraged to process their experiences rather than suppress them. Whether these changes would have helped Hartley is impossible to say. The structures that might have supported him did not exist in 1944, and by the time they were developed, he was already living with the consequences of his choice. The Pacific War ended in 1945, but its echoes continue. Veterans carried their experiences into families, communities, and a nation that had to rebuild itself around the memory of what it had done and endured. The war shaped foreign policy, cultural attitudes, technological development, and the very concept of what America was. Within that vast historical legacy are millions of individual stories, most of them untold, many of them lost. Hartley's story is one of them. It is not a story of heroism or cowardice, victory or defeat. It is a story of a man who, in the middle of a war that demanded killing, chose not to kill, and who spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that choice meant. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.